Good afternoon. I'm Simi Payne. I'm the chair of the International Union for Conservation of Nature World Commission on Environmental Law Ocean Law Group, and I'm a professor at Rutgers University. On behalf of the Deep-Ocean Stewardship Initiative, DOSI, thank you for joining us for this very important discussion on balancing climate and biodiversity actions affecting the deep sea. Today's discussion focuses on the need to balance climate and biodiversity actions in the deep ocean, and our panelists will explore how we can find synergies between climate mitigation and biodiversity protection, how we can identify co-benefits, and we'll discuss how global governance can support a climate-positive and biodiversity-positive deep ocean. We'll hear from each of the panelists, then turn to panel discussion and your questions. And it's my pleasure to introduce the session with Dr. Lisa Levin. She's a distinguished professor emerita at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, UC San Diego. She's a deep sea ecologist whose work spans over 50 research cruises and global policy efforts linking ocean science to climate action. I have to say that Dr. Levin has been a stalwart science communicator in the context of the brand new Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, too. She really played an essential role there. She'll set the scene for our understanding of deep sea connections to climate. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, great. Okay, I'm honored to be able to start this off. I want to talk about deep ocean roles in climate and how biodiversity plays into this, to set the scene for the rest of the panelists. I think everybody listening probably realizes we have only one ocean. It's shown really well in this Spillhouse diagram on the left, and that one ocean is critical for planet's health. It's a very highly interconnected ocean, and it's highly sensitive to human perturbations. And we know that most of this ocean is, in fact, the deep sea, that is, has depths below 200 meters. And this is true of 75% of our exclusive economic zone and fully 96% of areas beyond national jurisdiction. We also know that the ocean is our greatest climate mitigator. It has taken up I'm not advancing here. Let's see what's going on. Over 93% of the excess heat in the atmosphere, and this has led to changes in solubility and stratification that have led to oxygen loss in the ocean and also to reduction in primary productivity and export of food to the deep sea in some areas. The ocean also has absorbed 26 to 30% of the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this has led to ocean acidification. And while all these changes have occurred in the surface ocean, we know that thermohaline circulation has moved these features into the deep sea. So we now have a changing deep ocean. And this is affecting the ocean's biodiversity. And we rely on this biodiversity as critical part of the carbon cycle. The biological pump removes 5 to 12 petagrams of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year. The phytoplankton do this by photosynthesizing, taking in CO2 and turning it into organic matter. The phytoplankton aggregate and sink into the deep sea, or they're eaten by small zooplankton, which are eaten by bigger zooplankton, which may migrate vertically and produce fecal pellets dropping into the deep sea, or they're eaten by fish. In any event, all these different mechanisms move carbon into the deep ocean, where it's sequestered for hundreds to thousands of years. We know mesopelagic fish and epipelagic fish and great whales also contribute to the transfer of carbon into the deep ocean by their vertical migrations, through food webs, through organic the fall of carcasses. And then once that carbon reaches the seafloor, the animals on the seafloor act to accumulate and bury and sequester carbon. We also have ecosystems in the deep sea that filter methane, for example, methane seeps, preventing that methane from emerging from the seafloor into the atmosphere. And we have hydrothermal vents that introduce iron and other nutrients that help fertilize the ocean. So there are many, many ways the deep sea affects the carbon cycle. About 500 million tons of carbon are captured and stored in the high seas alone annually, with an estimated value of over $150 billion. So protecting this biodiversity will help maintain the carbon cycle and the Earth's climate. We know the deep sea is affected by warming that's happening. It's altering distributions of species. The loss of oxygen is causing biodiversity loss, habitat compression, and altered food webs that also affect the carbon cycle. Similarly, ocean acidification is causing loss of habitat and biodiversity. So addressing climate change will actually protect biodiversity that protects the carbon cycle. But many human activities threaten deep sea biodiversity and the carbon services it provides. Some of these activities also release sequestered carbon from the deep ocean, and examples include bottom trawling and overfishing, seabed mining, the burial of deep sea communication cables, oil and gas extraction, contamination, including plastics, and even marine carbon dioxide removal technologies, which seek to deposit waste CO2 in the deep ocean. We have many features of deep sea, high seas ecosystems that can inform climate and biodiversity positive actions. We need to recognize the great longevity of deep sea organisms, the high heterogeneity of habitat, their dependence on stable biogeochemical environments, the strong mutualistic interactions, and the strong connections of animals from the seafloor to the surface, across basins, and across jurisdictions. And we need to use this information to protect aspects of the deep sea, to create climate refugia, protect migration corridors, protect habit-forming species, and protect ecosystems with high carbon sequestration. We need to reduce climate change and associated parameters. We need to reduce physical disturbance, and we need climate-smart resource management in the mode of EIAs and fisheries management. So we have a mandate for the deep ocean to coordinate and align biodiversity and climate action. It's a real challenge with the very siloed management of different elements and sectors in the deep sea. But I want to close just with the comment that we cannot address climate without caring for the ocean's biodiversity. That's something the IPCC said, and the reverse is true. We cannot address biodiversity loss without addressing climate change. So I'll stop and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levin. We'll now turn to Dr. Ili Iglesias to take us on a tour of an understudied but climate-critical part of the deep ocean. She'll be speaking about conservation of the mesopelagic, and she'll also introduce us to a new policy tool created only a couple of weeks ago at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. Ili, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So as Lisa so eloquently introduced, let's see if my slides will advance. There we go. The ocean is this great mitigator of climate change. And to pass from the surface waters to the deep seabed, you have to pass through the mesopelagic zone. This zone is typically defined as the depths between 200 and 1,000 meters, and it's home to a diverse assemblage of organisms, including shrimps and squids and fishes and siphonophores. And as Lisa alluded to, a lot of these animals undergo diel vertical migration. This is considered to be the largest animal migration on Earth. And during this time, animals rise to the surface during the cover of darkness to forage on all the rich productivity at the surface. And then as they descend back to depths with daylight, in an effort to avoid visual predators, they bring that carbon with them where it can be stored on longer time series. Mesopelagic ecosystems are thus directly connected to the surface and also indirectly connected. They're prey for a lot of things that are perhaps more familiar to some of us, such as whales and dolphins, as well as economically valuable fishery species such as swordfish and tunas. Mesopelagic ecosystems are also very rich in biodiversity, although there's chronic undersampling of the biodiversity of this region in global data sets. And part of that stems from the fact that they're difficult to study. When we think about traditional scientific sampling equipment, for example, like nets, it gets more challenging to reach these depths. It's also expensive to access these depths. And for a lot of the organisms inhabiting the deep pelagic, they're fragile or gelatinous and thus can be damaged by large nets. So because of this, there's still a lot that we don't know. And in a global assessment of our current knowledge, we asked mesopelagic experts from around the world to weigh in on what they perceive to be our current knowledge for some of the fundamental aspects of science that would be required for effective management. And what we found was that there's really limited knowledge in some of the key fundamental aspects that would be needed, including biomass, so how many animals are out there, life history, how do they reproduce, how long are they living, energetic rates, which would be important for understanding the biological carbon pump. And importantly, we still don't have a really good handle on the effects of any anthropogenic activity. Science has advanced considerably, and we know a lot more about the connections of mesopelagic habitats to the rest of the ocean, but we still don't have a good handle on how any anthropogenic impacts might be affecting this ecosystem. One of the reasons for that is we have few long-term studies, again, because it's so difficult to access and study the deep sea that there are some great examples of long-term studies, but they tend to be limited in geographic scope. And this limits our ability to understand how climate change is affecting these ecosystems. As an example of some of the connections that we're just starting to unravel in the California current ecosystem where I'm based, we had the opportunity to use an acoustic data set to explore how a large marine heat wave event, which was believed to be surface intensified, might affect mesopelagic communities. And what we found was that the warming that was occurring at the surface indirectly affected the distribution of mesopelagic fishes. As productivity decreased in the upper water layers, what we think is happening is that more light actually was able to penetrate deeper into the water column, which mesopelagic animals responded to by descending, in some cases, up to 100 meters deeper than they would have been during pre-heat wave conditions. Similarly, if we look at the vertical extent of mesopelagic habitat in the same region using downscaled climate models, what we see is that if we define mesopelagic habitat as the lighted boundary above and the hypoxic dissolved oxygen conditions below, by the end of the century, it's projected that the extent of mesopelagic habitat may decrease by as much as 40 meters, which is about 39% of its current habitat, or it decreased by 39%. And so even though we think of climate change as predominantly affecting the surface, what we're finding is that the mesopelagic and deep ocean in general are going to be very much affected by this as well. But all is not lost. I think, as Simi mentioned, there's some bright spots. And just a couple weeks ago at IUCN, Motion 35 passed, and it was voted on by governments, indigenous communities, as well as NGOs in recognition of the valuable ecosystem services that mesopelagic ecosystems are providing, both for climate mitigation, for connecting food webs, and in their contributions to global biodiversity. And this measure has stipulations for ocean industries and is trying to put the onus on the ensuring that this ecosystem is protected prior to the development of some of these human activities. And so our science has told us that we know that this is an integrated, interconnected part of the world ocean, providing many important benefits, and a precautionary approach to its conservation is warranted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iglesias. And I think I omitted to mention that Dr. Iglesias is a National Science Foundation Ocean Sciences postdoctoral research fellow at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. My apologies. Our next speaker will be Dr. Joachim Claudet. He is the research director and ocean advisor for the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, and he's president of the Ocean and Climate Platform Scientific Committee. He has extensive experience in biodiversity conservation, sustainability science, and ecosystem-based management. He will be opening the door to talking about operationalizing policy in climate-smart marine protected areas from seafloor to surface and from exclusive economic zones to areas beyond national jurisdiction. Dr. Clay.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to be there with you too. So the first question we're gonna ask is whether marine protected areas can be effective for climate change mitigation or adaptation. So when we think about adaptation, there might be different processes that we want to account for. So MPA can either use for resistance, recovery, or adaptive potential. And so what we've done is that we've searched the literature and assessed the potential pathways through which MPAs can be or not effective for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And we've looked first at the positive, negative effects that were found in the literature. And we could see that there was a majority of positive, both social and ecological outcomes of MPAs for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Also, when we had enough quantitative information, we're able to do some meta-analysis. So let me do a kind of zoom in the carbon sequestration potential of MPAs. So first, for mangrove and seagrass, MPAs, so marine protected areas, are indeed effective at hosting more mangrove and seagrass, which are, as I'm sure you know, blue carbon ecosystem as they are recognized by IPCC for carbon accounting schemes. When also MPAs, inside MPAs, so in untrawled sediments, so MPAs when there is no trawling, they sequestrate significantly more carbon than areas that are exposed to trawling. And MPAs do harbor much more fish than outside area. However, further research is needed to quantify the exportation rates of organic carbon from fish biomass towards sediment. So when we look at some of the benefit, we can also, there is an important driver of the potential of MPAs to be effective is the level of protection. So MPA that are of low levels of protection, so lower than being highly or fully protected, they don't confer climate benefits. When they are fully protected, so when there is no fishing, no extraction, they do confer climate benefits. When they are only highly protected, they can confer benefit. And when we zoom into those MPAs, we can see that there need to be some zoning. And so among those MPAs, there are some climate benefits when there is some fully protected area in the overall zoning, and there is no climate benefit when there is no fully protected area. So from this, we know that MPAs can be effective for climate change mitigation and adaptation, and that the level of protection matter. But now if we look at the coverage of MPAs globally, what we see is that most of them are not fully protected. Only 2% are fully protected, and not all of them are really well enforced. And globally, only 1/4 of the MPAs that are reported to WDPA, the World Database on Protected Area, 1/4 are not even implemented, they are just declared. And among those who are implemented, 1/3 are not compatible with conservation according to IUCN standards, because most of the destruction, fishing, or extraction of resources are allowed inside those MPAs. And so we can see that they can be effective. Only few of them can be effective globally, but if we look across depth, we would see something very similar. So I will go quickly, but what we can see is that the aphotic is the benthic rim that is the most protected. The abyssal is the benthic rim that is the least protected, while it is the one with the highest, the largest surface globally. But this is also the depth that is the most common in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So BBNJ can become an opportunity for that. Also, the lower mesophotic and the ariphotic are the least protected. And among the levels of protection, we can see that the IUCN category 6 is the most common, which is among the least protected among all MPAs. Now, if we look at the fishing pressure across depth, what we see here, we'll go quickly because I don't have much more time, but what we can see is that the MPAs that are of the highest level of protection are implemented in the place where fishing pressure is the least present, even across depth. So this is called residual protection. That was observed when we looked at coverage, so on 2D, but it is also observed when we looked across benthic rim. So the depth that are the best protected are where there is the less fishing globally. And so now, if we want to increase overall the global system of MPAs to be more effective for climate change, so C is the current situation. We are at around 9% now. As you can see, if we only increase the level of coverage, we won't reach any climate change mitigation or biodiversity or food production benefits. We also do need to increase effectiveness, which is mainly driven by the level of protection. And so this will be my final slide. If we want the global MPA network to be climate ready, we need, first of all, to be fully protected. We need full protection, but also we need it to be ready for range expansion, range decrease, absence of fish that can go out of the MPA and never come back. So we need a combination of MPAs where species are today, where species will be tomorrow according to the best available scientific knowledge. And potentially we will need also dynamic MPAs that will follow fish range as they move. Thank you.
So I think what we are hearing now is that not only are the human uses of the ocean expanding in scope and innovation, but we need to respond with conservation measures that are equally creative. Our next speaker will be Dr. Liz Hetherington. She is a teaching professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She's a pelagic ecologist whose work focuses on food web interactions and human impacts on deep sea ecosystems. And she's going to take us further on the path of understanding how new human uses of the ocean require new knowledge and policy, talking about climate change risks and marine carbon dioxide removal, or MCDR. Liz.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. It's really nice to be here with all of you. Today, I'm going to be talking about marine carbon dioxide removal and the deep sea. So carbon dioxide removal refers to any approaches that aim to intentionally remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store it from decades, centuries, or longer. And today I'm going to focus on the technological approaches, so not things like nature-based solutions. And these technologies aim to enhance some natural processes to remove CO2 or increase the storage of carbon in some reservoir. And this includes the deep sea, because the deep ocean is a massive carbon reservoir. It's really important for our climate systems, as Lisa talked about. It's often seen as this attractive place to store more carbon. So several of these MCDR approaches are designed to store carbon in the deep ocean. Again, either by enhancing some biological process or directly placing carbon at depth. So here we have some examples that show things like ocean iron fertilization, which is adding iron to iron-limited regions of the ocean to stimulate phytoplankton growth, and then some of that biomass will sink to the deep ocean. Or direct biomass sinking of things like crop waste or seaweeds. There's also direct injection of CO2 into the water column or into the seabed. So these approaches, many of them aim to use the deep ocean as this way to store carbon. And these approaches and the way that it's spoken about often assumes that the deep ocean is this uniform, unaffected place, this big black box. But the deep sea is not an empty void, which we know, and it's made up of many distinct ecosystem types, and each of these ecosystems have distinct carbon cycling, distinct carbon storage potential, and biodiversity. It's made up of pelagic communities like Ely talked about, who are really important for transferring carbon from the surface to the deep ocean. Communities like or ecosystems like abyssal plains, hydrothermal vents, seamounts, and all of these ecosystems function differently. They have distinct biodiversity, and they're going to respond differently to addition of carbon. So any intervention that adds carbon to the system is going to affect things like food web dynamics, microbial communities and processes, oxygen, and then potentially ecosystem resilience and how long these ecosystems take to recover after disturbances. So when we think of these MCDR technologies, we need to think as of them in specifics. So where would they be deployed? Where would the carbon be stored? How much carbon could be stored? What ecosystems will it impact? Because the deep sea, again, is not a uniform black box. So this figure from a recently published paper by Gallo et al. To 2025 illustrates this point, that the deep sea is not uniform. It's not this empty storage tank where we can keep adding more carbon. It's a mosaic of many interconnected ecosystems, and each of these supports distinct biodiversity and processes, and each of ththese approaches will impact different ecosystems, whether it's addition of organic matter smothering benthic ecosystems, or ocean iron fertilization, which can alter midwater processes. Because the deep ocean is complex and not uniform, these MCDR technologies need to be studied in their specific environments and scopes and scale. And most of these, or all of these technologies rather, are still in experimental or small pilot phases. And the truth is, we don't know that they can deliver the climate mitigation that it's promised. We don't know if the carbon storage is durable, what the extent of the carbon removal will be at scale, and what the ecological consequences will be if we try. So I wanted to just highlight that there are many science and governance knowledge gaps related to MCDR and how it will function, if it will function well, and how the deep sea will be impacted. So I just wanted to highlight, I'm not going to necessarily read through all of these, but highlighting that there are these really large gaps related to MCDR. And one relates to processes of MRV, or monitoring, reporting, and verification. So how can we determine how much CO2 is being removed and how durable that carbon storage is over time? And this requires things like having pre-deployment ideas and baselines for carbon flux, biodiversity, biogeochemistry, which we don't have in many areas of the deep sea, our ability to measure the removal relative to whatever the natural variability is, which requires time series data. We need long-term tracking of CO2. And we have a lot of uncertainty in even these baseline data due to limited data and incomplete knowledge of deep sea processes. There are a lot of questions about sequestration potential, how long the carbon will actually be stored. And then there's a lot of knowledge gaps related to how ecosystems will respond, how biodiversity will be impacted, what the recovery timeframes will be, how resilient these ecosystems are. And also that there's no comprehensive legal framework to govern MCDR at this point. There's the London Convention and Protocol, which regulates ocean-based MCDR from ships, and the BBNJ now offers an opportunity to, because it requires environmental impact assessments for geoengineering technologies. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a disagreement over what acceptable risk is. So one thing that I wanted to emphasize is our real need for exploration, observing, and modeling to address some of these gaps as MCDR technology design and potentially test and implementation move forward. So we need to think about and focus on gaining information from natural analog systems. So there are examples of places or events in our oceans that can serve as natural analogs for these technologies. So looking at the Sargassum Belt and areas in the Caribbean where we see large fluxes of sargassum seaweed onto the sea floor, using this as a natural analog to organic matter sinking. And there are these examples over the global ocean. So what can we learn from these natural analogs? And also focusing on increasing our deep ocean observing, making sure that we have an integrated and global ocean observatory that can measure carbon, oxygen, biodiversity in these different deep sea ecosystems to understand baselines and how these systems might be impacted by MCDR. So I wanted to finish just saying that, as we've heard from today, the deep ocean is really important for sustaining climate, and that the deep ocean is not this blank canvas for MCDR or other experimentation. And we need to move forward with MCDR development with precaution, global coordination, ocean observing, and to build these technologies with science at the forefront and recognizing that protecting biodiversity protects climate function as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Liz. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Jiva Aman. She's a deep sea biologist at the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a founder and director of Species, that's SPE, capital SEAS, an organization dedicated to marine science, education, and advocacy in her home country, Trinidad and Tobago. She'll be talking about another novel use of the ocean, deep seabed mining, and its potential impacts on the deep sea's ability to regulate climate change.
Thank you so much, Simi. Can you hear me okay? Great. So as Simi says, I'm delighted to be here with everyone today. And what I'm going to share is about the sort of intersections between deep seabed mining and the ocean climate nexus, and the fact that ultimately deep seabed mining, which is an activity that has not yet begun, I want to be clear on that, how it can potentially impact the deep sea's ability to regulate the climate, particularly around carbon cycling, carbon sequestration, and carbon storage. And so I'll really build a bit on what both Lisa and Ili have presented today. So when we say deep seabed mining, what exactly do we mean? Well, this is a visualization of deep seabed mining in polymetallic nodule abyssal fields. And so you'll see there's this mining vehicle moving along the seafloor. It is generating this seafloor plume as it mines the seafloor. And the mineral resources it's collecting are being sent up this riser pipe here, where it is sent to a ship, which is waiting above. On that ship, this material you can see within the pipe, which includes nodules, the mineral resources, whatever they may be, sediment, seawater, and other bits, is then the minerals are separated out, as much of them as possible. And then there will be waste pumped back into the ocean. And so that will include water of a different temperature and chemistry, potentially sediment, and then also potentially fine metal particles as well, or mineral particles. And so what is important to note is that there are not yet finalized mining regulations. The mining code, as it's known, is not yet finished. And that means that depth at which the wastewater can be pumped back into the ocean, as well as numerous other things, has not yet been finalized. And so this is one of the proposed methods for deep sea mining. And however, technology may change and other approaches may arise as well. So where might deep sea mining take place? Well, there are 3 particular deep sea ecosystems at risk of deep seabed mining. You can see them each here on the left upper part of the screen. Those are polymetallic nodule fields in the abyssal zone of the ocean. This is one of the areas where there's the most interest, the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which stretches from about Hawaii to Mexico's exclusive economic zone and international waters. And there, in that ecosystem, we're just beginning to discover these places, and the CCZ, through the science that's being done in that area, we're finding, for instance, that it's turning out to be one of the most biodiverse places in the deep sea, and actually 88 to 92% of the species found there are new to science. And that's about 6,000 to 8,000 species living in this area. So not insignificant. Again, we are just beginning to uncover and really understand these places. In the top right, we have seamounts, mountains under the sea. You can see that sort of thick crust. These videos are from the West Pacific. And on seamounts, these are known to be hotspots of biodiversity, hotspots of fisheries, as well as hotspots of potential carbon drawdown. And then in the bottom video, let's see if we can play it again. We can see these are hydrothermal vents. And hydrothermal vents are probably the most iconic of the deep sea ecosystems. They are areas where super hot water, chemical-rich water gushes from the sea floor, and those chemicals in that fluid tend to power the ecosystems. The majority of animals deep sea species found living at these ecosystems are found only living at those deep sea ecosystems. So there'll be profound repercussions in all 3 ecosystems if mining were to go forward. And I should also say that hydrothermal vents have also been linked to the stimulation of phytoplankton production, as well as potentially carbon sequestration. So deep sea mining has been framed in the past and probably still continues to be framed as a solution for the climate crisis, a climate solution. And that's been done particularly around those who stand to make money and benefit from this industry. So deep sea mining companies or deep sea mining countries that have licenses or are engaged in this act. But that is not an accurate representation. So for instance, the European Academies of Science Advisory Council, in 2023, they released a report on deep seabed mining. And in that, they said that deep sea mining, which is framed as an essential part of the green transition, essentially, though they did not find any validity to those claims, they actually found them misleading. And that's not just because of the very real questions around whether any minerals that may come from deep seabed mining, whether they will actually make it into the mineral supply chain in the correct timing and proportions that are needed. But no, it's more than that. We know that there will be potentially negative impacts to the function, the essential service that we've heard from Lisa and Illy about, where the deep sea helps with climate regulation. And we know that there'll be negative impacts to that function as a result of deep seabed mining. I like to say that, you know, mining the deep ocean to solve the climate crisis is like smoking to lower your stress. You may get some potentially short-term gains, may being the operative word there, but ultimately there will be long-term damage on a much more severe scale. We know that, as we've heard from Lisa, the ocean absorbs heat, it sequesters carbon, and it stores carbon for a very long time. And again, mining can potentially impact that. And so how might mining impact deep sea carbon cycling and storage? Well, so this is, for instance, the area where a test for deep seabed mining was done many decades ago. And you can see that this picture, which was taken more than 26 years later in a polymetallic nodule field, you can see that those tracks still remain there, and there's been very little recovery. And studies in these areas have shown that decades after the tests, there's still lower abundance, lower diversity, and lower functioning in these ecosystems where tests take place. And so at the seafloor, we expect that the activities of bioturbation, because the mining process will result in both biodiversity and habitat loss, there will be a loss of bioturbators who essentially act to bury and store the carbon. And then additionally, we expect that the carbon storage function may also be impaired as a result of mining. There could be potentially the release of carbon from the seafloor. We are unsure on the actual quantities and severity of these risks. This is an area that we need a lot more study on, but the risk remains. And then in the water column, there will also be potential impacts if commercial deep seabed mining moves forward. As you would have seen from the video, there was the initial video I showed, there's the collector plume at the seafloor, which is where from the mining process. And then there's, as you can see in the midwater, a big dewatering plume. And so those plumes, especially the dewatering plume, will extend the impacts of mining both vertically and horizontally. And as you can see from the figures on the right, you know, these scales are not inconsequential. So in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, one area where mining has been proposed, we know that the plumes potentially stand to make the impacts of seabed mining as much as 6 million kilometers cubed of water column being impacted if mining occurs on the scale on which many would like it to happen there. So this is a massive part of the planet that potentially could be at risk. And as a result of that dewatering plume, there may be impacts to animals' communication, feeding, breathing, buoyancy, toxicity. This could lead to species movement, illness, death, species extinction. And we've heard already from Illy about the importance of the biological pump and those animals that exist in the water column and transport carbon down into the depths. And this is where very real risks, again, exist from deep seabed mining. And then finally, just to add, as we've already heard from Liz, you know, deep sea mining is yet another potential industry that may take place in the deep ocean, but we are still very much missing a lot of the scientific knowledge that we need to be able to make informed decisions. And that includes both, there are so many unknowns still around mechanisms, the scale, the severity of deep seabed mining impacts on deep ocean biodiversity, deep ocean functioning, and of course, climate regulation. And we're also still really struggling to understand how deep seabed mining's impacts may interact with other human activities. And so this image on the left, which I'm closing with, here you can see the darker, essentially there are categories of knowledge that are needed to make informed decisions that we did this table for each of the areas where deep seabed mining may take place in the future. The darker the color of the square, the more knowledge that exists. And actually what you can see here is that just 1% of the scientific categories that were investigated had enough knowledge to enable informed decision-making or informed management. And so really we are still operating in a paucity of knowledge with regard to this potentially very destructive industry. And that's why more than 960 ocean science and policy experts have actually signed a statement. You can see the link there in case you haven't signed on yet, calling for a pause on deep seabed mining until we have enough information to be making informed decisions. And so ultimately, what I want to close with is what we're seeing is the current rapid and unrestrained expansion of mining into the deep ocean in the absence of scientific knowledge to enable evidence-based decision-making will not support the sustainable use of natural resources and ecosystems. And it is ultimately at odds and could have very real implications for our climate and solving the climate crisis. So I'll close on that, and I look forward to the questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Aman. So I think what we heard very clearly there is that we do have enough scientific knowledge to begin to understand the risks, but we don't have enough to figure out how to avoid them or mitigate them if we wanted to go forward with some of these activities. Dr. Eric Cordes, who is a full professor and chair of the Department of Biology at Temple University, he's an ocean explorer, an ecological oceanographer, and has spent over 30 years studying deep sea ecosystems and leading over dozens of research expeditions, will talk to us about an area of change from traditional offshore oil and gas extraction to ocean-based renewables. In his talk, Offshore Energy, Renewables, and Fossil Fuel. Eric, please. Eric, you may still be on mute.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Amy. Thanks everybody for setting this up so nicely. I'm going to talk about offshore energy, which is going through a period of transition. For the past 50 or 60 years, it's been dominated by oil and gas drilling, and this is still the predominant way that we extract energy from the ocean, but we have numerous renewable technologies that are starting to come online. The first is probably offshore wind, which is catching on in different places around the globe, but we have wave energy, ocean thermal energy conversion, green hydrogen generation, combinations of all of these, ocean current energy and extraction of biofuels from the deep ocean. And of course, these all need to be managed as we continue this transition. And of course, the transition is probably the biggest impact we can have on climate change, getting away from oil and gas and transitioning to these new cleaner energy sources. But we still need to manage oil and gas drilling. It's still occurring and expanding in many areas of the world. And so we have proposed in this paper, and a lot of people have discussed, going more towards an ecosystem services-based management scheme than trying to manage individual species or a habitat. And we feel that this addresses a number of the different sustainable development goals. All of these types of deep sea organisms and deep sea habitats, many of which you've heard of already, this is one that maybe we haven't really talked about, are the cold seeps or hydrocarbon seeps that occur around oil and gas reservoirs, where you have natural gas and oil being emitted from the seafloor. There are so many ecosystem services that happen around these areas, including this biological filter, which is really talking about all of the microbes that live in these habitats that prevent the methane and hydrocarbons from being released from the seafloor and keep that carbon sequestered in the deep ocean. They create biogenic habitat, which creates habitat for fisheries, and there's a very direct correlation. Seeps are being managed as essential fish habitat in California, which sets a great precedent. Lots of marine genetic resources, and we've talked a little about the BB&J Treaty, which this is very relevant for. And then in the center of these ecosystems, but also as we expand out, we have cold water coral communities that the carbonate rocks that the seeps create, they create habitat that can establish these deep sea coral communities that can live for centuries to millennia. And they are locking a lot of carbon down in the deep ocean and preventing it from interacting with the upper ocean and the atmosphere. So in oil and gas operations, we have looked at a lot of the typical impacts, and this literature is very well known. And our recommendation was to have a 2-kilometer buffer area around anywhere that there's drilling to prevent some of the impacts to these cold seep communities, these cold water coral communities. There are still environmental impacts from offshore wind facilities, and we still need the baseline data and the management schemes to properly manage these. You can see some of the impacts here. One that has been more important that maybe has been overlooked in the past, but a lot of the modeling of the noise that's generated underwater by these offshore wind installations has turned out to be insufficient, and in real practice, when noise is measured here, it's a lot louder than you would think, and that our models told us. And so that's one that we need to be considering in the future, is noise impacts from all of these industries, really. There is a synergy here between climate change and these climate change variables in the ocean and energy extraction. In a study that we conducted not too long ago, we were looking at impacts from an oil spill. And of course, the synergy with wind isn't as there quite as much, since there's no wind spills offshore. We can avoid those by moving away from oil and gas. But the increase in temperature in particular, but all of these reductions in oxygen and ocean acidification affect the organism's abilities to handle further stressors. So if you have this sort of continual stress from climate change on these organisms, and in this case, we're focused on these cold water coral communities, it decreases their ability to tolerate additional stresses. It decreases their resilience to oil spills, their resilience to deep sea mining impacts, to fisheries, all of those kinds of impacts. Climate change just exacerbates the issue. And our options here are management, proper management, or restoration. And we've done a lot of work in the Gulf of Mexico, where I've been working for a very long time, following up the Deepwater Horizon. This is a study that looked at the cost of restoration in some of these habitats. And you can see that even very small areas are up in the millions of dollars. When we've tried to transplant corals, this is a very common practice on shallow water coral reefs, where you fragment corals and put them down to create new coral reefs and coral habitat. The survivorship of deep sea corals is extremely low. And so we're really, by trying to accomplish restoration, we're actually causing more harm than good in a lot of situations. So the proper way to do this is to manage these. And Lisa alluded to this, but the conservation practices that we need to employ are not for single, individual patches of habitat. These need to be connected, and the connections need to be along migration pathways, but they also need to be along life history pathways. And this is just an illustration of habitat use by fisheries relevant fish in the snapper grouper complex that go all the way from the estuary down to these cold water coral habitats. In the Gulf of Mexico, we've looked at some of these areas as candidates for conservation, and you need to find where these different habitats lie close to one another, where we can create these corridors and make sure that these species can carry out their entire life history in these habitats. So it is a little more complex than just setting up this 2-kilometer boundary around a deep water oil rig. But I would argue that with a little bit of forethought, we can maintain these services in the ocean, and we can keep the blue economy that we want in the future to help it to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. And our final speaker is Pradeep Singh. Pradeep is a senior project manager at Oceano Azul Foundation in Portugal, Lisbon, where he works on ocean governance and international advocacy with a focus on topics of concern like deep seabed mining and the ocean climate biodiversity nexus. He's a member of the DOSI Advisory Board, and he's also deputy chair of the IUCN WCEL Ocean Law Group. He'll be bringing out our attention to the fragmentation of ocean governance and the work to be done to achieve effective integrated ocean policy as he talks about governance challenges, harmonizing the deep ocean across the United Nations. Pradeep, please.
Thank you very much. Good day, everyone. And thanks, Simi, and thanks to the organizers for bringing us together. I'll just speak without slides, and I wanted to make 4 quick points. The first one is to recognize that most of the frameworks that we have today, these frameworks do not take into account the knowledge that we have today. So they were negotiated 40, 50 years ago when we talk about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which really sets out the governance framework for the ocean, as well as the distribution of maritime zones, do not take into account a lot of the knowledge that we know today, for obvious reasons, of course. But this also makes it very difficult to bring bring contemporary knowledge into the negotiation table. There's a lot of inertia, as well as sometimes arguments that, because we have this and this agreement, it's already a foregone conclusion that X follows Y. But fortunately, at the same time, we've also had a lot of normative developments. We also have new agreements like the BBNJ agreement, but normative developments in the sense of precaution. I think that came up several times today, the precautionary approach that is now finding its way in international law, as well as ocean governance, and other aspects include, for instance, the rights of future generations, that whatever we do today, we need to take into account how this would affect future generations. Now, the second point, coming to fragmentation, it is obviously the case that ocean governance is largely fragmented. It's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you have more groups or organizations looking into environmental protection. But it is an issue when we talk about potential inaction, gaps, or even contradictory action that's taken. So the fact that we have a real piecemeal approach in different fora, for instance, in areas beyond national jurisdiction, where we have many different instruments, frameworks, and bodies. One other, I think, additional factor that complicates things is that states tend to be a bit schizophrenic at international fora, so they may say one thing at Forum A and say something else at Forum B. For instance, saying something really positive when they are negotiating at the Convention on Biological Diversity, but then maybe going to the International Seabed Authority and saying something else on seabed mining. But even within national jurisdiction, there's a lot of competing interests from different sectors, different ministries, so fisheries, shipping, economics, environmental ministries, tourism, and so on. But there is hope. We have the new BBNJ agreement. Hopefully that at least takes us a step forward in areas beyond national jurisdiction. But we also have the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, this aim to protect 30% of the ocean that might create a pathway forward. And also on that note, we have 2 recent court decisions, and I'm sure Simi would like this for me to mention, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, as well as the advisory opinion from the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, which really tells us more about climate change and the need to take action to protect the ocean. Now, just a final point on negotiations. It's difficult, attending several negotiations now to integrate the deep ocean, let alone the ocean, in some of these other fora, like the climate negotiations or the biodiversity negotiations. But hopefully, with recent efforts like the UN Ocean Conference, the momentum for the ocean will carry forward into these negotiations, something to work on that all of us need to do. So in terms of political will and what we need to do right now, is, of course, encourage more marine scientific research, capacity sharing, but also mechanisms for science to policy exchange. And I think, IUCN's work was mentioned today, but also the work of DOSI as well, in really participating and attempting to inform negotiations that are ongoing is really crucial. And I think just to end, maybe finally, what we really need to think about is how can we change this mindset that we now have about extraction and resource use to view blue natural capital as something that is really important. So essentially, how can we show that conservation and protection is actually profitable? And I'll end with that and hand back to you, Simi.
Thank you so much, Pradeep. So let's turn to the panel discussion. And we can start with the question, I think, this to you, Lisa. Could you give us an idea of how you would approach raising the profile of the deep sea in the world of climate and biodiversity policy?
Okay, that's a big question. Well, I think I would try to continue and advance the work of DOSI, which has been to try to synthesize the science from the primary literature, condense it into understandable policy briefs, and then bring it directly to the negotiators. And, to do that in person, at side events, at UN meetings, to have conversations with the negotiators making deep sea policy. So, and events like this, of course, online events can also be very helpful. I think bringing it directly to some of the voting blocks in the UN, putting things in front of the G77, that turned out to be very successful, bringing climate into the BBNJ agreement, with AOSIS and some of the other big groups of nations, I think is important. I do think beyond the UN meetings, raising the deep sea profile in the global assessments like IPCC and IPBES and the World Ocean Assessment is really important, and we are working hard to do that, but then bringing all that information together somehow and getting it to policymakers, we need to work more on that. And then I think, okay, I'll stop there because we got to leave time for other people. Yeah.
And Eric, did you want to comment on this briefly, please?
Well, I mean, Lisa covered most of it. I think that the talk around deep sea mining and the BBNJ treaty gives us an opportunity to really bring the deep sea to the forefront, and understanding a lot of these connections. I think we already do know quite a bit about the deep sea that we can present in these fora. And I think bringing the issue, in addition to these places, bringing it directly to the public and communicating and showing everyone the beauty of the deep ocean and trying to foster that connection between people and the deep sea can only help.
Ili, most of our speakers are scientists, and yet you all have information that's necessary for policymakers to achieve goals of planetary health and equity. How have you overcome the challenges of communicating your science?
Thankfully, we have this diverse, rich assemblage of animals to do a lot of the talking for us. I think we all have this innate curiosity with the deep sea. I just had to present in my daughter's little kindergarten class a couple weeks back, and it reminded me that the deep sea in some ways sells itself. I think where we've fallen short as scientists in our communication is that we haven't prioritized linking the deep sea to our everyday lives. And so I think work that focuses on the interconnections between the deep sea in climate mitigation, in food webs, in providing global diversity is really beneficial. So trying to focus on actually connecting it. It's not this other world as it's often touted, but it's affecting all of us.
Diva, do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, I think Ili hit the nail on the head. We are essentially an egotistical species. And so the more that we can relate things to us, the better. And again, while it may be out of sight and out of mind, it is not out of our reach. And we really need to hit that home. But I think the other thing I wanted to add is that, I think, sure, we can all sit here and present, but I think what really brings, connects people to this part of the planet is the power of imagery. The deep sea is not only important, it is not only vulnerable, but it is so beautiful, absolutely beautiful and captivating. And when we show that, whether it is to decision makers, policymakers, or members of the public, it often takes their breath away. And I think that is often what we can use to really open up conversations and get people to engage and think about this part of our planet.
So, Joachim, we think about management of the ocean and it's how heavily siloed it is. Is there one particular ocean action that you would most like to see occur that would benefit climate and biodiversity, and which UN bodies would you think should be involved?
Thanks for this great question. Yes, fragmentation of ocean governance is really one of the main threats to the ocean in general and the deep sea in particular. But there is hope. I think with most of the countries being really happy about the BBNJ ratification, there is a kind of momentum with some countries calling it for good or bad reason, but the Ocean COP, which is not on the paper, it's the BBNJ COP, so biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. But people will soon realize that to implement what is planned in BBNJ, there will be needed some collaboration among UN bodies. So if you want to implement an MPAs that do make sense, and we've seen with some of our talk that you need to reduce threat in MPAs, you need to think about the 3 dimensions of the MPA. So you need to regulate activities that will happen on the high seas that can impact biodiversity, which are overfishing and deep sea mining, and potentially, who knows, MCDR. So to have MPAs from BBNJ that do have positive impact on biodiversity, you need to regulate a lot of human users that are outside of BBNJ. And so countries will have to stop being schizophrenic and talk, and we've heard about that also, talk among the different sectors and agencies within them and coordinate a bit more. So hopefully there will be coherence, a bit more coherence, thanks to BBNJ.
And Pradeep, I imagine that you also have some reflections since you spend so much time working with the UN process.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think not much to add, except that while it is true that, international law, ocean governance, these sort of major decisions are state-driven, ultimately, yes, but, it's still what happens in between that really matters. And that's where we all have a role to really be the ones that power or fuel that sort of negotiations that happen there. And so, yes, fully support all the points that were said before this. We need to hold states accountable, and that's what the International Court of Justice recently did as well in that advisory opinion, really, speaking plainly about it, and working across UN bodies and getting them to talk to each other. We heard about the World Ocean Assessment, which, of course, really assesses the state of things, but it's not policy prescriptive. So how do we turn what we know today into policy relevant messaging? And that's where we all have a role to play, including to shift this mindset that I mentioned, that conserving and protecting perhaps is more profitable, or is definitely more profitable than short-term extraction. Thanks.
Yeah, Dosie's done an amazing job on this too. So congratulations to all of you on that. Lisa, what do you think are the key knowledge gaps that we face linking biodiversity and climate?
Oh, gee. I would say there's probably more gaps than knowledge at this point when it comes to the deep sea. Certainly, our understanding of the biological systems in the deep ocean and how the processes and how they respond to perturbation is a big gap. For that, we need more deep ocean observing. We need to observe, well, we do have gaps just understanding the changes that are happening naturally in the ocean, and then the backdrop of human perturbations. But one of the things that has come to mind recently is listening to discussions on various committees about MCDR and how reliant we are on models for the monitoring, reporting, and verification of at-scale MCDR. I'm hearing we aren't going to do it with observations. We have to do it with models, but the biological models of response to those perturbations don't exist yet. So I feel like that's a huge gap, is we actually need the in situ science to be able to produce viable models to predict how the ocean would respond to things like massive iron fertilization or ocean alkalinity enhancement, so on. So those are a few.
Great. Liz, do you have any thoughts on science gaps that you think need to be prioritized?
Definitely going off of what Lisa has already said, improving ocean observations, and also observing more, even simple assessments of biodiversity, and then linking what species are there to their function is difficult. And then even assessing biodiversity in a way that there's lots of methods to do that, right? And doing that in a way that is uniform, so we can compare, or at least comparable between systems, is a really big challenge and is a gap. So more assessment of biodiversity of systems, a better understanding of linking biodiversity to function, and then having ecological indicators. So if we are deploying MCDR or mining, what are indicators of ecosystem function in these different ecosystems, and can we define them and can we measure them so we have a better understanding of tipping points or effects, things like that.
Interesting. So I have two final questions I'd like to invite everybody to answer, but extremely quickly. So and I'll just tell you both questions at once. So one is, if we could create an internationally determined contribution like the NDCs under the Paris Agreement, but for the global ocean, what would you include to protect deep sea carbon stores and biodiversity? So that's question one. Question two is, what gives you hope? And I think I'm going to go in reverse order. So Pradeep.
Well, what second question first, what gives me hope? I think, the fact that we're continuing to organize meetings, webinars, and workshops to discuss topics like this, with the aim of bringing, our consolidated knowledge and findings to decision makers. That gives me a lot of hope. It gives me a lot of hope as well that, there's building momentum all around us to really elevate the ocean agenda in various fora. And to get the support, as I mentioned, from the International Court of Justice, that for me really gives me a lot of hope to continue this work. And IDCs to protect the deep sea. I think that would be really an incredible achievement if we are able to even start talking about this and getting that through. But I guess that would involve really creating large marine protected areas, including in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so the BBNJ agreement and the first movers proposals in that would be, I think, the first step, I guess, in that direction.
Okay. Let's see. Eric, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of things actually give me hope. I don't think we can, there's so much happening in the world that we have to believe that through the small actions we can take, we can have a collective, we can enact change through grassroots functions. And I think that bringing some of this knowledge to people directly, as Diva said, showing them the video and the beauty of the deep sea and communicating this directly with them can really change people's minds and get them invested in the deep ocean. And I think that can help us moving forward. And I'll stop there.
Great. Diva.
I mean, my answers kind of merge into one. What gives me hope is the BBNJ agreement. Like, honestly, I think we're going to see this, new era for the ocean, the potential putting in play designation of large-scale marine protected areas in the high seas. And that is, I think, where we stand to make huge gains. In terms of the internationally determined contributions, just adding on to what Pradeep said, I really do think that whether it's MPAs and ABMTs or, your country being able to commit to, for instance, preventing extraction that we know has profound climate impacts like deep sea bottom trawling or, for instance, deep sea mining that shall avenues forward.
Joachim.
Yeah, I will kind of repeat what have been said because I agree with everything, but I would focus on I would cross two things. So the potential, the carbon sequestration potential, and human activity. So I would focus on places that can store potentially high carbon, but at the same time where human threats are removed potentially through MPAs or other kind of area-based management tool. So we are both targeting the potential and the threat.
Eli.
Also mirror all the thoughtful comments from everyone before. I would just add my for me, what gives me hope, but also I think is a challenge, is that the deep sea is so much of it doesn't belong to a single country. It belongs to all of us. And I think as part of that, it's going to require a lot of international collaboration. But just hearing from the panelists today and in participating in the DOSI Fisheries Working Group survey of mesopelagic experts, there's a lot of wonderful people around the world who are interested in this. And the opportunities and challenges in working together to try to solve these solutions is what gives me hope and is hopefully going to be something that we see in more general fora. Thanks.
Liz.
I definitely want to echo what's previously been said about what's giving me hope. BB&J is a big one. And also interacting, I teach a lot of students, and interacting with young people who are driven and passionate and interested in these issues gives me hope for the future. So eager young people always give me hope for the future. And then yeah, I again echo what other people said, but recognizing that deep sea biodiversity is not separate from climate mitigation. It is, it is essential kind of climate infrastructure, and I think that message is really important.
Great. Lisa.
Well, not surprisingly, the things I was going to say have been said, but I will say for an IDC, I would love to see a global MPA network on the high seas that promotes carbon conservation, maybe 30% of the high seas, maybe more. And then what gives me hope, really all the dedicated scientists that I've watched over the past decade put so much of their time and energy for free into bringing science to policymakers through DOSI and also other networks. And of course, the BB&J agreement gives me great hope. And I really hope the scientists can help it bring climate positive opportunities to the actions of the BB&J. Yeah.
Well, those were great responses. And I have to say for my part that working with this community is so inspiring and energizing that it gives hope that people will continue to engage. So we have a few minutes for audience questions as well. And I would like to start with Abigail Pinto-Gutzman asks, how can we strengthen the dissemination of knowledge about the deep ocean, overcoming language barriers, especially since most of this information is available in English? Who would like to tackle that? I don't know, Joachim, is that as a French speaker, something that perhaps you have some insights on? Diva.
I see that Diva, yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like you lucked out there, Joachim. I think that's a really hard question to answer, given the hegemony of English in science. But I think there's a few things that can be done, and unfortunately, none of them. Well, the biggest one is not an easy fix. We're seeing in the deep sea more and more scientists from around the world participating in deep ocean science, and many of them want to contribute to science in their native language. And so, for instance, I know there are, for instance, amazing scientists in Costa Rica who are taking that extra step. Unfortunately, I think the step does come on to the individual scientists who are producing the research, but many of them are working in their native languages and translating their papers into Spanish, for instance, and storing it in openly accessible places, as well as working with their policymakers in their native tongue, etc. So that is one of the places I see, but ultimately we need to be investing in scientists in various countries around the world, no matter the language, so that they can be able to put their stamp on deep sea science and communicate it in their language, essentially.
Yeah, it's a tough problem. Yes, Lisa.
Just a quick comment. Telepresence by the Falkor 2, for example, has been broadcasting real-time imagery from the deep sea, and the language of the country that they're in has been out on the waves for everybody. So that's a start. It's mostly
cool.
Spanish.
And
recently.
also adding that, Lisa, aren't many of the DOC policy briefs translated into Spanish and French? I think several of them are. So there are at least small steps to getting us to a place
There's
where...
a few being translated into all the UN languages right now.
Great.
Though, of course, the UN languages don't cover some important language groups, but still, we try. There was actually more of a comment from Louise Sanger, but it raises an interesting question. She mentions Charlotte Jarvis's Threats to Our Ocean Heritage, Deep Seabed Mining, which combines cultural heritage considerations into the challenge. And does anyone care to comment on that, or should we just leave that as it is? It's certainly an issue and something that is also integrated with this question about language. Oh, Pradeep, please.
Yes, maybe just very quickly, the conversation about cultural heritage is actually ongoing at the International Seabed Authority. And we've seen in the last 3 years, in particular, more and more indigenous people coming to the ISA to voice their concerns and asking for a seat at the table to bring their perspectives to the decision maker. So we've seen an uptick of side events and so on, but there's also discussions in the negotiations of the regulations that Diva mentioned, the mining code, to really integrate indigenous perspectives into the decision-making structures, including potentially creating an advisory panel of indigenous people to submit input into the ISA process.
We have some questions that have been answered in writing, but I think maybe I'll briefly mention them and invite in the, well, we really only have a couple minutes left. So maybe I'll just invite, I think all the speakers can see what the answered questions are, and I'll invite you to take a look. If there's anything that you would really like to respond to, maybe raise your hand. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left, although I think we can go a little bit over that. Eric, please.
Yeah, just quickly, I think, we talked about knowledge gaps, and I think there are, as Lisa said, probably more gaps than there is knowledge, but we have been studying the deep sea for a long time. And I think that this narrative that we don't know anything about it is a false one. I think we know a lot of things about the deep sea. I think we know that creatures grow very slowly down there and have very long lifespans and are therefore very sensitive to disturbance. We know that there are these amazing habitats on Earth, including the cold water coral reefs, which cover more of Earth's surface than shallow water coral reefs. We know a lot about the deep ocean, and I think it gives us pause when industry starts to move deeper that this precautionary approach is really probably the one that we should be going forward with because of all the things that we know. Illy talked about the diavertical migration and this transfer of massive amounts of carbon from the surface to the deep and that ecosystem service. It's incredibly important and needs to be preserved. And we don't really even know how to do that or how a lot of these biogeochemical processes that lock up carbon work. So there are some of those things, but I think we do know a lot about the deep sea. We can communicate it, and it gives us a lot of reasons to want to protect it.
That's really, I think one of the really valuable takeaways from this and hearing your depth of knowledge from everyone in this session. So thank you very much for all sharing your knowledge, both the science and policy expertise you bring to the table. Thank you to the audience for joining us today or watching the recording, if that's what you're doing. We'd like to acknowledge our partners, the Scripps Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy, the Ocean and Climate Platform, and would like to offer Dr. Balgos a moment, and then I'll have a final comment after that.
Thank you, Simi, for putting me on the spot. But I love it. I love this session very much. And we would like to let you all know that we are trying our best to raise the profile of ABNJ to various stakeholders. And we're doing that through our JEF-funded UNEP project on cross-sectoral ABNJ management. And then there's another project coming along to assist countries in their pre-ratification and ratification process. And that requires a lot of public outreach and communication. So your role in producing science that can be communicated to the public is really, really important. But thank you so much for being here and communicating with our attendees. Your input is so much valuable and we treasure it so much. Thank you so much.
We hope that you will join DOSI's roundtable on November 17th on opportunities in the BB&J agreement for advancing climate action in the deep ocean. That link for that should be appearing for everyone. And also, we invite you to explore DOSI's exhibit at the Virtual Ocean Pavilion with many resources, podcasts, videos, webinars, articles, all kinds of things on the importance of the deep ocean for the global climate. And there should be a link to the Virtual Ocean Pavilion exhibit from DOSI also visible for you. With that, we thank you so much for your attention and for your commitment to the ocean, to continuing to bring science together with new ocean technologies. It's an essential next step for the planet to deal with the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So